Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. So, if you're somewhat familiar with Star Wars Legends and I ask you, hey, what started off the modern era of Legends? You might very well say Dark Empire or the Thrawn trilogy. And well, you wouldn't necessarily be wrong from a narrative standpoint. For me, I always go back to the original West End Games source books. Now, they weren't the true beginning of the expanded universe. For that, you could point to, I guess, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, or even the original novelization or comics. However, what the West End Games source books really did was set up how the universe worked. The ships, technologies, ideas, which would be drawn heavily on by people like Timothy Zahn in creating later novels. Scrolling through the Imperial source book, for example, I'll see the Carrack Light Cruiser, the Victory Star Destroyer, parts of the Empire like the ISB, all of which was thrown out into the world in 1989. However, while the Imperial source book specifically did establish a lot that would remain super prevalent about the Empire, including the aforementioned ships, the ISB, the idea of there being an Imperial Army, Navy, etc. Other stranger aspects of the Imperial military really didn't end up getting a lot of attention in later source material. I talked on one occasion about the Ubictorate, which was a government body responsible for managing pretty much all aspects of Imperial intelligence. The Ubictorate is not really mentioned very much in Star Wars Legends even, and the way Imperial intelligence is handled generally would sort of change in the novels. The, I think, less obscure focus for today's video is Compnor, which was the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order. Compnor was less of an overtly violent organization of the Empire, though it did have its own military forces, which we'll get to in a bit. Rather, it spread Imperial ideals and doctrine largely through propaganda, and was meant to be a sort of constant pressure across the galaxy. I'm actually jumping in while I'm editing this because I think this point deserves some clarification. Although Compnor wasn't overtly violent, in that there weren't as many, say, Compnor stormtroopers running around, they did almost always use violence as a way to accomplish their goals. Some of the art for Compnor you'll see sometimes uses Hitler Youth style imagery, and there's definitely some similarities there. Compnor was basically meant to be something that seemed to be just a genuine social movement, but was actually a propaganda arm of the Empire itself. Regarding the Hitler Youth aspect specifically, the Imperial sourcebook says specifically, Compnor is more than a vocal and enthusiastic group committed to raising young Imperial citizens to be totally loyal to the Empire. It is also, I'm going to go slightly off script here, played an important role in recruiting, and its influence has become so pervasive that the Imperial bureaucracy was under its complete control. What that means essentially, and again, think about the name, Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, is that Compnor played an important role in making sure that the whims of the Emperor and his minions not only were heard by the public, but were executed by the Empire's almost endless bureaucracy. For that reason, it's probably not surprising that after the Imperial Senate was dissolved, shortly before the destruction of the Death Star, Compnor became even more important and sort of moved into that slot, ensuring that orders from on high were accomplished throughout the Empire. And I know what you're thinking, that sounds a lot like the ISB, and if you've read new Star Wars canon novels especially, there's been a lot of focus on how the ISB is meant to sniff out traitors within Imperial ranks, police speech with an eye for treason, read messages of Imperial officers, etc., etc. And the reason this sounds like the ISB is because the ISB was actually one arm of Compnor. Specifically, Compnor had 5 subdivisions, which were focused both within and without the government and military. On the civilian side, there was the Sub-Adult Group, which was responsible for spreading the Empire's ideals. There was a group people could officially join as supporters of the Empire, again, sort of like the Hitler Youth. And within there were further subdivisions meant to do everything from re-educating the populace to actually recruiting people into Imperial service. You'll have to understand here, there's not a lot of imagery I can show, but these charts, which I've been putting up on screen, do show the breakdown of this arm of the Empire. I think the most interesting Compnor subdivision is the Coalition Coalition for Progress. This was also civilian facing, and this was really the source of overt censorship and propaganda from the Empire. If art was going to be limited, that decision would come from the Coalition for Progress. You can pretty much imagine what the Empire would want to do to ensure that civilians sort of followed into the new order. So, for example, there's an educational subsection which sought to, and I quote, homogenize the level of education throughout the Empire to place emphasis on the values cherished by the new order. I'm going to skip the Coalition for Improvement. It's not that interesting and it's sort of just tied into the other divisions, but it's on page 21 of the Imperial Sourcebook if you have it. I'll briefly touch on the ISB, and I'm going to say briefly because in my Ubictorate video I actually covered how ISB differed from Imperial Intelligence. And I do just want to note, while Star Wars canon has placed the ISB as almost totally an organization which focuses on those within the Imperial military, that's not actually how it's described in the sourcebook. Rather, the ISB is meant to help uphold the ideas of Compnor and thus the New Order itself, and it's more like a police force. Perhaps ironically, perhaps not, the ISB actually put a lot of focus on Compnor itself. One of the problems, however, is that the ISB is quite power hungry and are often redefining rules, so even internal audits can be beset by political maneuvering. The ISB essentially had no rules other than to uphold its mandate and thus the new order, and were able to interrogate people. They could use torture, they could essentially set people up, and then once someone is found guilty, they could either use some method of re-education or something more drastic if needed. Anyway, moving on from the ISB, the final arm of Compnor is a very strange one known as Comp Force. It's described by the Imperial Sourcebook as the military arm of Compnor and was created to give the Empire large forces other than stormtroopers on whose loyalty he could absolutely rely. And I mean, it makes sense. You want to have, if you're someone like the Emperor, a redundancy plan and a group of individuals who are committed to you and the new order above all else. I say it's strange because, to my knowledge at least, we've never really seen Comp Force appear in any other material. Perhaps other source books, but in a way it's something that appears on paper in the background and never really features in stories. And I'd obviously contrast that with the ISB, which is frequently invoked. The Imperial Sourcebook has some interesting tidbits about Comp Force. For one, they receive priority treatment in the allocation of equipment, resources, and medical attention. That's a direct quote. And for once, that's not because they're the most effective branch of the Empire. I don't think there's anything that suggests that. Rather, because they are the most dedicated. In fact, it's even somewhat suggested that the Comp Force in general wasn't very effective. The main service branch was known as Assault. It had a very high washout rate in training, with 88% of people failing to make it through. And I say washout, but a good portion of people who failed to make it through training actually died. These were also volunteers, not elite selected troops. I mean, there are obvious benefits of that though. If you have someone who believes in the Empire enough to not only join Comp Force, but go through the incredibly grueling and deadly assault training, you probably have a soldier who will happily go to a suicide mission and do their duty. Compnor as a whole was managed by what was known as the Select Committee. Unlike the Ubictorate, which oversaw all of Imperial Intelligence, the Select Committee actually had tens of thousands of members, and I guess would have operated somewhat like a Senate, obviously though without the democratic process. There's definitely a lot of secrecy here, and I will note that the Imperial Sourcebook actually suggests that the rumors of 10,000 plus Select Committee members may be incredibly exaggerated, and there could be 1/100th of that number. Anyway, I hope this explanation shows that Compnor was not only complicit, but largely responsible for the perpetuation of the evils of the Empire. Racism or xenophobia, slavery, the removal of liberties, these were not only actively allowed by Compnor, but they were encouraged, and those ideals were meant to be made a part of society and were enforced through things like violence, propaganda, and more. And of course, Compnor worked with other parts of the Empire to help ensure that the new order would last forever. Compnor has made its way to Star Wars canon, and most of the information seems to have been taken verbatim from Star Wars Legends. There's still that idea that rather than being simply one part of the Empire, Compnor is sort of this shroud which affects all aspects of the bureaucracy and the military. But that's really all I have for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to see me cover in the future, let me know down below. Until next time though, guys, have a good one, be safe, and may the Force be with you.